The First Amendment is one of our nation's most cherished values.
But that doesn't mean that it's wise or beneficial to use hate speech.
The American Religious Town Hall is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome to the American Religious Town Hall. I'm James Weingardner, sitting in for Pastor Lutz. And this week we have an important topic and an interesting one, and I'd like for our panelists to introduce themselves to you, beginning on my right.
My name is Bishop Michael Olson, and I am the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
My name is Canon John Peterson, and I am an Episcopal priest, canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Carl TROVALL. I'm Professor of Ethics and History at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
Hello, my name is Tony Matthews, and I am the Senior Pastor at North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas.
We're very pleased that each of you are here. We've spread out a little bit for the COVID experience to give some social distancing, and we're looking forward to today's topic. One of the most cherished values in the United States is the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. Today, in particular, freedom of speech is the rallying cry for some of the most outlandish behavior, which oftentimes is a license to harm others and incite violence. One of the questions the courts struggle with is, can acts of violence perpetrated by hate groups in public spaces be somehow traced to the free flow of hate speech and political rhetoric in the public arena? For example, during a demonstration when protesters burn buildings, when bricks are thrown at police and people, either bystanders or demonstrators, are hurt or killed, can this be traced back to hate speech, which is protected under the Constitution because the United States does not have hate speech laws? Even back in 1919, the Supreme Court argued that freedom of speech does not include the right to incite actions that would harm others in Schench versus United States, 1919. Today, I'd like our panelists to consider these questions. One, is there too much violent hate speech today being protected by the First Amendment? Two, today, as we struggle with racial inequality in this nation, is there any limit to hate speech? And three, are demonstrators today getting around the 1919 Supreme Court ruling? These are good questions, and we're looking forward to hearing your answers. Bishop?
Thank you. I believe the First Amendment presumed, at least on the part of our founding fathers, I think there was a presumption that things like family and associations were somehow a guiding principle on this. And as speech developed and as arguments developed, etc., we gradually, the Constitution gets shaped and formed within its times. But the First Amendment is absolutely required in order for us to have a peaceful transition of power, in the sense that the United States was always known as the nation where we could talk and we could settle differences peacefully through the rule of law that required as well the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, freedom of religion, these fundamental rights prevented us from having very violent revolutions at a time of transition. I think many times today we see as speech has been lowered in its caliber, if you will, of respect and civility, we've seen also an uprise in violence and the lack of a rule of law. You know, freedom of speech doesn't permit the firing of a building or of the assault upon law enforcement officials or bystanders. or the tearing down of public property or private property for that matter. And I think that if we had a greater respect for the freedom of speech and the responsibility that comes with it, we might have less of these problems.
Carl?
Yeah, I thought about this and I thought I want to approach this anecdotally. Got that out. And I've found that when I'm around people who speak respectfully of other people and speak kindly of other people, put the best construction on everything, that I tend to do the same thing in imitation. Maybe also desire to belong with the group. So there's maybe some social pressure there as well. But I've also been around groups where there's been disrespect toward other people for various reasons, maybe a political position or maybe an academic position. And words can become nasty, or I guess it could turn into hate speech. And while it's technically legal, I guess, it's just not right. And I find myself also falling into the same kind of habits that those people. I begin to demonize and to create prejudices, and I begin to speak in the way that I'm receiving that speech. And so that's why I think that, you know, if you can take a scientific experiment and tie a hate speech to a specific violent act, that might be hard to draw from point A to point B. But as I said, just taking this caricature of my own kind of experience, I think all of us know that feeling, that there is a connection between people treating people with disrespect and denigrating the humanity of another person for whatever reason it is, and then it falling into a kind of action. It could be something as simple as not opening the door for someone. I mean, it doesn't have to be a violent act even. It could just be incourteous. So I genuinely believe that while we may protect speech, that doesn't mean that it's all good or beneficial for us. In fact, I think it's usually detrimental. And I'm just going to close out by talking about Jesus. I mean, he says, out of the heart come these evil things, that it's first in the desire that all these things begin, and then it's in the completion, the following through of it, that becomes problematic. And so you have thought, speech, action. I think those are all connected with one another.
Thank you, Carl. Tony?
It's a very good topic. Of course, we have the freedom of speech, and I value that. I think our colleagues are spot on. You know, we need to be responsible in what we say, and we have the right to free speech. The question is, are we going to be responsible in what we say? I like the question here, is there too much violent hate speech today being protected by the First Amendment? When speech leads to, hate speech leads to crimes or people being abused, beat up, I don't know how far or to what extent government should be involved. I'm always, you know, try to be real careful getting the government involved in monitoring and or censoring our speech. But I do think there has to be some type of accountability with hate speech. And then another question we need to ask, is speech harmful if it's true? If I'm speaking truth and someone interprets that as hate, and we give the government permission to investigate it or examine what we're saying, groups can be targeted and treated unfairly. I know hate speech nowadays, it's basically in the vein of racism or dealing with sexist language. What about when you have groups who will say, well, we believe this about the definition of marriage? There have been hearings and cases where groups have been depicted as being hateful groups because of that type of speech. Where does that go? So that's a challenge that I think we all are confronted with.
John?
Yeah, certainly a timely subject for us to be thinking about. because of the amount of hate speech that we are experiencing within our society and our culture today. It's rampant. Freedom of speech is one of the factors that does not make us a totalitarian dictatorship. And so certainly freedom of speech is extremely important to have. But where are the lines? And it seems to me that the courts in particular are always having to try to draw that line in their judgments that they make, as we saw back in 1919. The problem that we face is the freedom of speech itself a license to incite violence, incite bad behavior. And frequently, because of this protection that hate speech has, I think we see more types of hate speech. And hate speech that those of us sitting around the table who are over 50 would never have seen 25 or 30 years ago. I mean, it's rampant today. And the way in which people are abused and the way in which people are abused, both the abuser and the abused. And so I think that we really have to be very careful in relationship to what are the limits of hate speech. And indeed, hate speech is protected by the United States Constitution. I mean, there's no question about it. There was, in this last session of the Supreme Court, they actually are dealing with some of these issues, so just a few months ago. David Childs, I found from the Northern Kentucky University, asked the question, can recent acts of violence perpetrated by hate groups in public spaces be somehow traced to the free flow of hate speech and political rhetoric in the public arena? And it seems to me that this is really a very important question that he has raised, the free flow of hate speech and political rhetoric. And when those two things are combined, you have a lethal combustion about to happen. And so it isn't just simply today hate speech, but also political rhetoric that borders very carefully and closely on the whole issue of hate speech.
That's a very interesting point. I think that the third factor there, the third thing is the volatility, where your political rhetoric has become less reasonable and a lot more emotional, with the emphasis on rhetoric to inspire reaction, all right, and not to convince with reason, or at least where people can disagree without being disagreeable. And that tenor, I think, has changed things a lot. Like, for example, you know, I believe in what my church teaches on the function of sex in marriage only between a man and a woman. Well, in some circles, that makes me a bigot, all right? Now, a bigot for upholding just what I believe to be true without making any sort of derogatory epithet or slur on anybody, all right? And I think that because we've lost reason and we're so much living in the world of the limbic system of just an emotion run rampant, it's very hard to have rational discourse. And when you say, well, let's take this through reasonably, people throw a trump card and they say, my conscience, just my conscience. Well, why is your conscience bothered? My conscience. It's like a tautology. There's no further explanation. And we're meeting just in a very dark and nebulous world of narrative. And I think that it's hard, if not impossible, to agree to form a society based only on narrative and certainly not only on emotion. And I think the church, just as much as we have each in our own traditions a responsibility to evangelize the faith, I think we also have a responsibility to evangelize right reason, now more than ever, and especially in leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Carl?
I was just, as you all were talking, I also thought, I think so often we confuse hatred with other kinds of things. Like you mentioned, Tony, you mentioned speaking a hard truth. You just mentioned speaking, having a clear position on the subject of sexuality and having a disagreement about what the meaning of that is. I was also thinking of anger. I mean, we often see anger, but anger isn't hate speech either. Anger is completely appropriate given many contexts. Whenever we see injustice, we should be furious and to act accordingly. But using hatred is the wrong. That's the wrong mechanism for the utilization of anger.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The case that's mentioned here, is it Schrench versus United States, 1919. That case involved this gentleman and someone else passing out leaflets for people to disobey the draft. And I'm just trying to think how far we've, and that was categorized as something that was absolutely detrimental to society. And of course, with a lot of the rhetoric we see now and today, it's just kind of light years.
Sunday school picnic.
Yeah, right. It's just light years away. And from a scriptural perspective, if righteousness or if someone's righteousness and someone's wickedness, according to Ezekiel 18 and Deuteronomy 24, cannot be transferable to someone else, I think the argument can be made that we should probably stay away from trying to transfer hate speech from one person to the next. I think it's a slippery slope, but at the same time, it needs to be checked somehow. And how you do that without legislation, I think the church needs to get involved and teach people, preach. We have to just communicate responsibly.
I agree, and I think the checks and balances that were in there at the start of this country were not legal. The law just sort of set the parameter in the ground, and what was understood that, yes, there are limits to free speech that are things like, well, don't lie, don't slander, don't hurl hateful epithets out of anger, don't bear false witness, don't gossip, some very basic things of respect. And when we just argue the law without looking at morality, that there's something more required of us than simply compliance to a law, I think that's our responsibility to live the gospel or to live according to the tenets of our religious faith, whatever it is.
Yes. Last July, we all relived the civil rights movement with John Lewis's death. And we certainly saw what happened at the Edmund-Pettus Bridge. And the type of language, the type of action, the type of hate that we saw that day when he crossed that bridge, and how that continues today, but only amplified. I mean, I think we are in a serious situation when actions are so violated because of race and religion and all that carries into the situation. I mean, how people spoke, how people acted to John Lewis that day. Today, he's a saint. But back in the civil rights movement time, he was anything but a saint.
Yeah, it makes me wonder too. What's the response to hate speech? It's love, right? And I guess to the extent we're able to forgive. Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. I mean, that's a pretty tough. That's a high bar, but I still believe that it's a true bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think from our perspective, we can advocate that, but it doesn't really answer the question of the legal one. And the legal one is do we move the bar? And that's a really hard question. And I think the bishop correctly identified that the bar existed in a different soup. That's a mixed metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah. Bar soap?
Yes. The line existed on a different field in the creation of our country than it is today.
Yeah.
The field today is a very different place, and far less respect, far less decorum is endemic to this field than was in that one.
There just seems to be a functional atheism behind this too, where we don't see God involved in this, or we're not accountable to God, and we end up with the lowest common denominator.
This is a great discussion. We have a little bit more to go right after this break.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
We really would like to hear from you, and we'd like to hear from you in your comments on these subjects and also suggested future subjects. And now it's time for our summations, and so let's start with the Bishop.
The topic of our program was if there were any limits on the freedom of speech. Now, that's a constitutional question and a legal question that a lawyer can answer, but we're addressing this as pastors from our own different traditions. And I would say that there are limits on a freedom of speech, I mean, basically structured by the 10 Commandments. So, for example, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not gossip, thou shalt not blaspheme, thou shalt not harm unjustly another person's self-esteem by words that wound. There are a host of these things, and when we exercise our free speech as people of faith and people of right reason, we have a responsibility to do so respectfully and well.
Michael, you chose a Christian tradition. I'm going to share a Buddhist proverb that I found that has been very helpful in guiding me, and that is that if it's not true and not beneficial, don't say it. If it's true and not beneficial, don't say it. And if it's not true but beneficial, don't say it. But if it's true and it's beneficial, wait for the right time.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. In the moderator's statement, for example, during a demonstration, when protesters burn buildings, when bricks are thrown at police, and people, either bystanders or demonstrators, are either hurt or killed, can this be traced back to hate speech? Wow. I think Paul Miller is a professor at Georgetown University. He's also a fellow researcher at the ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He says in an article that's titled, Is There a Biblical Defense for Free Speech? He says, let's assume that for a moment that speech can harm, like we've just read here. Is that grounds for regulating it, the government getting in and regulating it? He says, he still says no. And I think I'm where he is because I don't know how far that will go. So I think there's something called personal accountability and responsibility. So if I hear hate speech and people are inciting violence through their words, and if I go out and burn a building, if I go out and throw bricks, that's based on what I heard, I should be held accountable for our actions. I just think that's where, and frankly, unfortunately, sadly, we don't see that happening today. We see people freely, in many places, burning buildings down, just doing all kinds of awful things, and many of them are not being held accountable. And if you can take those actions and trace them back to hate speech, where's the accountability for the people who are actually doing the action? The personal accountability.
Thank you, Tony. John?
Well, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. What is a more poignant saying, you know, as a result of hate speech, of hate actions? And so we really, you know, have a, and I'm in total agreement with you in what you've just said. I'd also like to respond actually to something that the bishop said, and that is when one starts looking at the Sermon on the Mount, for example, the Sermon on the Mount is a form of a legal document. Yes, indeed. There is legal language in that. And the question is how then do we interpret it? How does the community determine how we're going to respond to what does it mean? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You know, you shall. And so, I mean, that itself places responsibility on the community to decide. And right now, one of the problems we face is that what has happened to hate speech, and why does hate speech rule the day, like hate speech is ruling the day. One of the things we've not yet spoken about today that I think is very important, particularly in this last decade, is the social media platforms. And we've not discussed the type of impact that social media is playing in this whole area, and the arousing of anger and hate that comes as a result of Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram and other social media platforms. So I think that that's certainly something that we need to discuss at some time, because it's a serious situation.
Speech, what's the old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can really hurt me.
Yeah.
So this is an important topic, and I think we should have another program to discuss perhaps the Christian or spiritual response to hate speech. The charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. The rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.